Let's go to our regular 2101, by the way, is the text number if you want to take a guess. We're giving away the Bond album, Best of Bonds. Let's go to our historian, Grant Morris. Hi, Grant.
Hi, Jesse. How are you?
Good, brave man. Ford versus Holden, and you're in the Ford camp.
Yeah. I mean, I should preface this talk by saying that I'm not a real car aficionado, but I definitely come from a family that's always bought Fords and never bought Holdens, so definitely on the Ford side of this debate.
When did it begin for you?
So for me, actually, as I said, my family's always been a family that's bought Fords, and I've continued that. I just bought a new one the other day, and just looking to sell my old one. So there's a strong tradition of Ford purchasing in my family. But I also remember back in high school, it was fourth form, and we'd have a group of friends, and we'd hang out at lunchtime. And one of the main discussions that we'd have was around Ford and Holden. And I wasn't probably the most passionate person in the discussion, but some of the others were very passionate. It was really, a matter of great pride and honour for them as to which side they were on. And some of the myths and, I suppose, inaccuracies that came out of those debates, I still think about. And one was that one of my friends was absolutely convinced that Ford, historically, was an Australian company. So, despite me trying to tell him about Henry Ford and the proud American tradition, he was convinced that it was an Australian company. And I can understand how that could be when you look at the history of Ford and Holden in Australasia, in this part of the world, and just how we've kind of, as a culture, and I include Australia in this as well, have taken on Ford and Holden kind of as our own, even though, Ford in particular has obviously a rich American history, and Holden is owned by General Motors, which is an American multinational company, but also is really more Australian than New Zealand. So that debate was something that I always found interesting. And then when you look back and look at this rivalry, it goes such a long way back in New Zealand, and we have this history of Fords and Holdens being assembled in Australia and New Zealand. And many of your listeners will know that the Ford assembly plant began in Seaview in Lower Hutt and Wellington in 1936. So we're getting Cortinas and Escorts assembled there up until it closed in 1988, and also in Whitty and Auckland. Ford's assembled there. We've got General Motors assembly plant in Lower Hutt as well. Holden begins in 1948 in Australia, initially exported to New Zealand, but then assembled in New Zealand for some time as well. So a real presence both in Australia and New Zealand, but always with this background of being owned by these American companies. So that's the beginning of the rivalry.
Yeah, and you sense that the rivalry may be dying out, but it kind of peaked in the 80s.
Yeah, and this is when I would have been having the discussions with my friends around Ford versus Holden. And I think part of why it peaked in the 1980s was the advent of the Ford Falcon and the Holden Commodore. And we're so familiar, if you're over a certain age in New Zealand, you're so familiar with that, let's call it a sub-rivalry within the main rivalry. These big, touring sedans, gas-guzzling, that kind of look quite similar to the uninitiated. And both were manufactured in this part of the world as well, and were particular to this part of the world. So you get the Falcon being, manufactured by Ford Australia from 1960 to 2016, and also assembled in New Zealand up until the 1990s, after which time it was imported from Australia. And then you get the Commodore, its main competitor, manufactured from 1978 to 2017 in Australia, and 1979 and 1990 in New Zealand. So they're not Australasian cars in the sense of being pure, homebred, developed, and company owned, but we take ownership over them. And when we see, the rivalry they had on the V8 racing circuit, and we see, that how often they were taken to be things like police cars or taxis, they became iconic in New Zealand, and I see that height of the rivalry being with the Commodore versus the Falcon.
So how did the rivalry end, if people agree with you that it has ended?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's still there in the sense that you can see Holdens driving around, you can see Fords driving around, but in the sense that it had that presence in Australasia and New Zealand, I mean, that sadly is gone. So Ford stopped making cars in Australia in 2016 and had stopped in New Zealand for some time. Obviously still sold in New Zealand, but in terms of the assembly. And then the Holden was their production was ended in Australia in 2017, and as you listeners probably know, the brand itself is being discontinued now. So, it's quite sad in a way that we have this legacy, this historical legacy of these cars for so long, but that is now drifting. And, you could say that Ford won, but in the sense that the brand remains and the cars are still sold in New Zealand, and the number one most popular car in New Zealand is the Ford Ranger. But if you do see that it won by default, in the sense that these were decisions made by big multinational companies who didn't care too much, I don't think, for the historical legacies that Australians and New Zealanders were so proud of. They were obviously, as companies, making decisions on the bottom line. But yeah, in that sense, Ford remains, and Holden is being phased out. But I think it can tell us some interesting things about our history, and that's we can take pride in these locally assembled products, but there's an irony there, because in many ways Ford is a quintessential American story of Henry Ford, and yet, like my friend demonstrated, we almost took it as a New Zealand. And maybe you can make analogies there with something like rugby, which we take as a New Zealand, specialty and treasure. Yet it developed at rugby school.
No, you're really stirring it up now, Grant. You have to save that one for another day. I'm just bracing myself for the text from Holden owners. Thanks for that. Great to chat to you as always.
Cool. Okay, thanks,
Dr. Grant Morris. He's a historian from Victoria University of Wellington School of Law.
A bottle of something nice? Nah. Some lovely smellies? Not on your life. If you want to get someone a unique gift, then make them a Lord or Lady of Glencoe. As a Lord or Lady, you'll have your own wee plot of land located on a nature reserve in Scotland that you can visit at any time. Not only is it a fun gift, but you'll also be joining over 250,000 other lords and ladies in helping to conserve Scottish nature. Prices start from just £30, and to get a 10% discount, visit highlandtitles.com/offer.